Hey, it's Rachel. You can probably see a bunch of cover crops in the garden behind me, and it seems like this time every year, like clockwork, I start getting a lot of questions about cover crops and soil health and timing. Rather than answering separate questions on the dozens of different videos that I've made on individual topics, figured I would make one comprehensive integrated video to go through everything I know and everything I do to improve the soil health in my garden. If while watching this you think this seems kind of obsessive, fair enough, but bear in mind I am dealing with very, very heavy clay soil. Think a good 4 to 5 inches of solid gray clay was in place when we bought this property. Because my garden is large, at about 2,500 square feet, I did not have the budget to go purchase topsoil and compost and bring it all in. Instead, I'm working with what I have and relying on my own planning, physical labor, and the passage of time. You can see some of these beds behind me. I have 10 of them in total on a 10-year rotation. And I'll walk through what I do at each stage in my crop rotation to show the logic of how actions taken in one year pay off for the crops coming the year after. I'll create chapters in this video to make it easier for you to navigate. Showing it this way at each stage of the rotation, it lets me go deep on some of the why behind it. But it will probably make it seem like a lot of work, a lot of unrelated little activities, and a major time suck. I promise it is not. In reality, this is all done in much more concentrated and efficient ways. At the end of the video, I will give you a calendar view showing all of the beds and everything that happens week by week to show how I clump these things together. I'll cover questions I get every time right now. I am gardening in Southeast Michigan, USDA Perennial Zone 6A. My frost-free days run from right around Mother's Day to right around Halloween. And throughout this video, you'll see me referencing those holidays as well as a few other major holidays and milestones that I used to mark key activities and dates in the garden so I don't forget them. All right, let's dive in. I'll start with my fallow year, as this is the year when I do the most work to improve the soil. As I mentioned, I grow my annual crops in 10 standard sized beds following a 10-year rotation. One of those is a year off where I really focus on just the soil health. My garden beds are defined by concrete blocks and are each about 23 feet long and 7 feet wide, with a wood chip access path down the center. At the beginning of the year, the growing areas flanking that path are covered by a layer of leaves and cover crop debris. St. Patrick's Day is my first major holiday in my garden calendar. That's the day I usually rake off all of the debris from that fallow bed and add them to my compost pile. I then set up a cattle panel trellis across the bed using 5 16-foot panels braced by T-posts. I sow a mix of peas and oats into the growing areas, rake it in, and water well. By Mother's Day, another significant date for me, those have matured and they're about up to my knees in their height. I'll address now why I'm using cover crops at all, as opposed to just putting organic mulch on top of the soil, and why I use pea and oat as often as I do. The main benefit of a cover crop, or green manure, is that they push living roots down into your soil. Those roots then exude sugars into the soil immediately around them, and that feeds billions of microorganisms living in that soil. The difference between dirt and soil is life. Soil is alive and full of tons and tons of little microherds that form symbiotic beneficial relationships with your plants. You want to feed them as much as possible. Why do I use peas and oats so often? Oats develop large, fibrous root systems. They can go as deep as 6 feet. And peas are legumes that have symbiotic relationships with bacteria that colonize their roots. Those bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen gas into usable ammonium ions in the water in your soil. You could use any other cereal grain instead of oats. Think wheat or rye. And you could use a different legume instead of peas, such as vetch or crimson clover, or really use a seed mix of all of the above. Really doesn't matter as long as you get something that gives you fibrous root structure and something that will help you fix nitrogen. So right around Mother's Day, as those crops have reached their full height, but before they start setting seed, I go through with a very fancy stick and length of rope and flatten down the cover crop as shown here. If you picture people making crop formations in cornfields, you've probably got the right idea. Once that crop is all flattened down, I lay a piece of black plastic tarp over it. Those are cut to the standard size of my beds. By Mother's Day, when I'm doing this work, I am past the risk of frost, and I also use this time to plant some pole drying beans all along both sides of the trellis at the base. These are a harvested crop for me, not a cover crop, but they do fix nitrogen in their roots, similar to the peas, and I think of them as part of my fallow soil routine. Going back to that cross-section view, as the cover crops are crimped down and die, this is what happens in the soil. The roots die back and are consumed by the microherds in the soil, feeding that life while leaving teeny tiny tunnels and cavities that allow oxygen and water to penetrate deeply into the soil. The organic matter left behind improves my soil texture or tilth, and the nitrogen held in the pea roots is released as they die back. I wait a couple of weeks to make sure the cover crop has thoroughly died. I then shovel a couple of inches of compost on top and rake that smooth. I sow this with a buckwheat cover crop as my second round of green manure for the year. Going back to the cross section, the debris are now sandwiched between 2 layers of soil, and those will break down and be worked into the soil by worms and other recomposers down there. Meanwhile, the buckwheat establishes and grows and adds even more root matter to the soil, although it doesn't go nearly as deep as oats and it doesn't fix nitrogen. But it is great for 3 reasons. First, it is an absolutely amazing pollinator plant, and it attracts bees and other pollinators to the garden in droves, helping with the pollination of everything else. Buckwheat, importantly, is also able to mine phosphorus from the soil. Part of what it exudes from its roots is an acid that can take the mineral form of phosphorus in your soil and dissolve it and make it available to the plant. Buckwheat then concentrates that phosphorus in its own tissues, and when we terminate the cover crop and allow it to break down in the soil, all of the phosphorus that it pulled into itself is now available in a form that other plants can use. The last great point on buckwheat is that it is very quick to mature. You only need about 6 weeks from planting to termination, and that makes it easy to fit in this fallow bed where I'm doing multiple rounds of cover crops in a single growing season. And that's good, because I want to terminate it by the 4th of July, another major milestone date for me. By that point, the pole beans have also come up and started to cover the trellis. This gives me some much appreciated shade as I do the next step. I crimp it flat, repeat that tarp for 2 weeks. Once it is thoroughly dead, I repeat the compost layer, and I sow round 3 of my cover crop, this time mustard. Why mustard? 2 reasons. First, much like buckwheat, it also attracts pollinators in droves, and that's a nice boost for the rest of the garden. Second, mustard has a chemical in its tissues that can act as a biofumigant to help rid my soil of diseases that can in particular affect Solanaceae crops like tomatoes or peppers. This is important because the following year in my rotation, I'm going to have a ton of tomatoes and peppers planted in this bed. When the mustard is terminated and its tissue decomposes in the soil, it releases allyl isothiocyanates, or AITCs. These are the chemicals that give mustard, horseradish, and wasabi their kick, and they can act as a helpful fumigant against a variety of diseases, including verticillium wilt. By Labor Day, my next major garden milestone date, the mustard is full grown and ready to be terminated. I crimp it down, repeat the tarp, check a couple of weeks after Labor Day to make sure it's good and dead. Then I repeat my compost layer. Going back to that cross-sectional view, you can see the mustard debris are now sandwiched, much like the other ones were before. As they break down, they'll release those AITCs deeply into the soil to benefit next year's tomato and pepper crops. I seed that compost with my good old pea and oat blend, and I wait until Halloween, the last major milestone date on my calendar. By now, the pole beans have matured and died back, as I will have had my first frost round now. Once my harvest of those beans is done, I cut off the bean plants at soil level and remove them from the trellis. Their roots then release nitrogen as they decompose. With the trellis out of the way and moved to next year's fallow bed, I can then use my trusty stick and rope one last time to terminate the cover crop. I add the tarp, but I only leave it on for like a week plus or minus 2 days. It's on for a shorter period of time because my goal isn't to get this all the way to brown and crispy death, but just to a point of surrender to make sure that it is laying down flat and not trying to pop back up again. I then add a layer of leaves several inches thick, and the cover crop continues to gradually die back underneath that thick layer of leaves. Why the change up here with less tarp time and the leaves? What I'm trying to do is create a composting in place situation. I want that cover crop to still be green to act as my nitrogen material for the compost, and the leaves act as the brown material for my compost. By putting both of them together, my goal is to have compost form in place on the surface of the bed while it sits over the winter. The leaves, in turn, are very rich in mineral content, and they're free. I'm on a 2-acre property here. The property is absolutely covered in maples and a couple of oak trees. We get a lot of leaves. We have to rake them up anyway. And by using them in this manner, I get an extra benefit for the garden. If I put them in place while they're very dry, they form a nice, fluffy, insulating layer. And even as my subsequent fall rains and winter snows come down on top of them, they will compact down, helps them stay in place. But it does insulate quite well. I was shocked the year we had our polar vortex. I was really pleasantly surprised to find that my soil did not freeze at all under that insulating cover of leaves. This means that worms can keep working that soil all the way through the winter from top to bottom, integrating all of these wonderful root debris that we've been putting in place throughout the year, improving the tilth and working all of this through the soil in preparation for next year's crop. Speaking of, let's move on to year 2. Year 2 and 8 are basically the same and are way less involved than that first fallow year. We start off the same way with that leftover cover crop debris and leaf layer put in place last Halloween. It's about 8 to 9 inches deep when it first goes on, but by the time we get to Mother's Day, which is the first time I have to do anything with these beds, this has compacted down to maybe 2 inches in total depth, and it has formed a water permeable but not light permeable layer, and it's very effective at discouraging weeds. I leave that all in place until Mother's Day, when we're past our last spring frost, and when I set up my paste tomato trellises with nylon netting and T-posts. I then use a standard 6-inch bulb planter to make planting holes directly through those debris and into the soil beneath, and I place my tomato and pepper plants straight in. The mulch stays in place with my drip irrigation lines on top of it, though it does continue to break down a bit in the sun. It helps to retain moisture and prevent weeds while the tomatoes and peppers size up and produce their fruit. By Labor Day, I'm usually done with my final paste tomato harvest, and I remove those plants by cutting them off at soil level, leaving their roots to decompose in place. And I also remove my trellises by rolling up the netting and removing the T-posts. After this, I carefully spread a few inches of compost in place. Before, in the fallow bed, I was spreading it on top of a dry, crispy cover crop that wasn't going to go anywhere. With my tomato and pepper beds, I'm putting the compost on top of that fluffy leaf layer, and it does require a little more care. I tend to put it down and spread it by hand as opposed to shoveling it on and raking it. I then sow cover crop mix of peas and oats into this, but I do add in Daikon radish as well. Those leaf debris are now sandwiched between 2 layers of soil, just like our cover crops were before, and they'll break down and be worked into the soil by worms and the other recomposers, and the whole thing will settle in place. Meanwhile, the Daikon or tillage radish drives its huge roots deeply into the soil, really opening it up, but without the mechanical disturbance of using a plow for mechanical tilling of the soil. That cover crop is mature by my key date of Halloween. I crimp it to terminate it, I tarp it briefly, and once it is compliant but still green, I add that same layer of leaves. Moving on to year 3, my sweet potatoes. Much like with my fallow bed, I start with the debris in place, and I rake them off into my compost pile on St. Patrick's Day. But for this bed, I then go through with a pitchfork. I would use a broadfork if I owned one, but I don't. I insert that deeply into the soil, and then I lean back gently to lift the soil without turning it over. I work backwards, forking the whole bed to deeply loosen the soil. I then leave it alone until tax day. Okay, I realize tax day isn't technically a holiday, but it is painfully easy to remember, and it's a helpful milestone for me because I do have quite a few tasks in the garden that need to happen right around that time. That's the day my sweet potato bed is prepped for planting. I go over the surface with a stirrup hoe to kill any weeds that have popped up since St. Patrick's. I then lay down a black tarp, not to kill things this time, but to encourage warming of the soil ahead of my sweet potatoes. By Mother's Day, it's been warming for a few weeks, and my last frost has passed, so I remove that tarp and I plant my slips. Those have completely consumed the bed by Labor Day, and it's then time to harvest. I have to harvest the sweet potato vines before my first frost. They are frost tender. That comes a couple of weeks before Halloween. So a couple of weeks before Halloween, I will get out there, dig up all of the sweet potatoes. And because I've already had to dig up the bed anyway, and I've disturbed the soil life completely, I take this as an opportunity to do some trench composting. Now, trench composting is when you take the leftover residues of whatever you grew in the bed, the parts you didn't harvest, and you bury them in the soil in which the plants grew. The idea is you're returning almost all of the trace minerals and nutrients that were taken out of the soil when those crops grew, and you're adding in carbon that they pulled from the air in the form of carbon dioxide. I have some decent footage of this from our old property when I did this with some tomato vines. After cutting them down from their trellis, I stomped them flat to get them to break down a little bit, and then I fully buried them in the soil to completely break down over the winter. Moving back to a section view of the soil, the vines are clumped together down the center and they do start breaking down. By Halloween, the whole thing is settled down a bit, at which point I add a protective layer of leaves on top to help the worms stay active and continue to break all of this down. I used this trench composting method a lot more in the past when I had a smaller garden, but it's a lot of physical labor. And as I moved into this larger property, there's simply no way I could do this on all 10 of my beds. That said, I do try to prioritize doing it for my sweet potato bed for 2 reasons. One, as mentioned, I have to dig up the whole bed anyway, so the incremental amount of work involved is not too bad. And second, the following rotation year has my root crops in this bed, and they all benefit from a very deep, well-worked soil. So if I'm ever gonna do this, I'm gonna do it the year before those crops. Moving on to that year in the rotation, we're now on year 4, all of my root crops. This will sound very familiar. On St. Patrick's Day, I rake off all of the debris into my compost and I use a pitchfork to deeply loosen the soil. I wait until tax day to prep the beds, let things warm up a little bit. The difference is that right after I use a stirrup hoe to weed the bed and to create a nice smooth surface, I immediately sow my radishes, beets, and carrots, and I transplant in my onions. I'll keep using that stirrup hoe in between the rows to control weeds, and beneath the surface, all of that work from the prior year is paying off, as the carrots in particular enjoy loose, deep soil to set healthy roots. Mid-August is a key time in the garden for me. There weren't any great major holidays that I can use to help remember to do this work. It is National Lazy Day on August 10th, and the irony alone makes that a pretty memorable milestone for me, so I use that as a reminder to myself of things I need to do at this time in the year. This is when I harvest out the last of my spring root crops, rework the bed one more time with that pitchfork to get the deep, loose soil, and I weed it with a stirrup to catch anything that I didn't get before. I then plant a pea, oat, and mustard cover crop, raking it in and watering well. I include the mustard because the following year this bed will have potatoes in it, a Solanaceae crop, and I want to fumigate for that disease ahead of time. That cover crop is mature by Halloween, and I follow the usual routine of crimping, briefly covering it until it's flat and compliant, and then covering it with a blanket of leaves. Moving on to year 5, we've got the potatoes that I just mentioned. For this bed, I do not rake all of it off on St. Patrick's, but I do fork the whole bed, going through that residue. Right around tax day, or whenever I see dandelions blooming, I transplant in my potatoes, previously started in grow bags to get a head start. I already hilled them up a little bit as I rolled up the edges of their grow bags, and I bury them outside at a 9-inch depth. The traditional approach would be to plant the potatoes and then hill them in as you go. I prefer to leave the soil as undisturbed as possible, which is why I rely on hilling them up in their grow bags and then transplanting deep. By National Lazy Day, it's about time to dig those up, my exact timing depending on how the plants look. While I do prefer to leave things in place and leave my cover crop debris and compost to layer up and build soil, with potatoes, much like sweet potatoes, I am digging up the whole bed basically anyway. While I'm at it, I take all of that leftover leaf and cover crop debris and I shove it into the planting holes from which I have just removed the potatoes. It's not a lot of extra work to do that since I'm in there digging anyway, and it allows those leaf materials to get worked deeply into the soil as opposed to only staying on the very surface. After burying the debris, I add more compost if needed, and then I sow another cover crop of pea, oat, and mustard. Here I'm putting the mustard in after the potato plants to act as yet another round of fumigation, plus it's an added benefit for all of my local pollinators as it grows. Here's that cross-sectional view again, showing the debris inside. I'll flag that I do not bury the potato vines themselves, the way I did with the sweet potatoes, just in case any of them are harboring disease pathogens. If anything looks diseased, it is thrown away, but everything that looks healthy goes into my compost bin for hot composting. By Halloween, that cover crop is mature and ready, and I go through the same termination process. Crimp, cover briefly. Once compliant, I cover it all with a blanket of leaves. Year 6 is when I have to deal with long maturity crops that must be left in place, my kale and my Brussels. I don't do anything in the spring really. I just leave the debris in place while my transplants are inside sizing up. Right around tax day, I use my trusty bulb planter to transplant in Brussels sprouts and kale plants into that bed, along with fertilizer in the plant holes. And then I don't do anything. So the kale and the Brussels really need to stay in place for a long time. I harvest the kale on a leaf by leaf basis all through the spring, summer, and fall. And I try and leave it in place even through the winter to give me harvests. It's very, very cold hardy. The Brussels have a very long days to maturity, and they're going to take a long time to size up. I will eventually start harvesting these kind of now, so sort of October, November, but they both need to be left in place for a long period of time, undisturbed, with me not doing anything to the soil around them. And honestly, that's fine. At this point, we're halfway through the rotation. The soil has had multiple years of wonderful cover cropping and compost additions. It's healthy, it's deeply worked, it has a high organic content. I can skip a year, it's fine. So if you have long maturity crops, don't stress, just try to put them all together in one bed and think of that as your off year when you just don't do anything to the soil. Moving on to year 7, when the bed is used as a mixed polyculture tunnel, I take any remaining kale or Brussels sprouts and I cut them off at soil level right around St. Patrick's Day as things begin to warm up, and then I rake off any remaining debris into my compost. I set up a cattle panel trellis and I sow peas along both sides of it at the base. I use a stirrup hoe to create a fine seed bed, and I put in my first wave of salad greens and beets. By Mother's Day, those salad greens are well established, and it's time to put in my summer vining crops now that we're past the first frost. Those go all along the base of the trellis on both sides. This is also when I sow my edamame plants on the other half of the bed. By the 4th of July, another milestone date, the peas are done with their harvest, and I cut them off at the base. Their roots then break down and give the heavy feeders still growing on those trellises a nice boost of nitrogen as they decompose. In addition to cutting off the pea plants, I use the 4th of July as a reminder to sow a pea and oat cover crop around the edamame. By the time National Lazy Day rolls around, the edamame has petered out and I'll do my final harvest, and then cut them off at the ground and leave the roots to decompose. It's also time to plant my winter carrots, and I interplant them between my existing salad greens. The moist, shady microclimate under the greens helps with carrot germination, and they have compatible, non-competing root structures and leaf heights. And those points about the carrot make it a great time to talk about the benefit of planting diverse plant families for your soil. Until now, my beds have been largely focused on a single crop or plant family, and sometimes that's just unavoidable when you're growing a lot of something, but it does mean that you can have issues with diseases and pests that affect certain families, as well as the risk of depleting specific nutrients out of your soil when certain crops consume a lot of them. I manage this with a rotation that spaces those plants in the same family several years apart, as you can see here with my Solanaceae crops shown in yellow and my Brassica crops shown in dark green. Even better though is a proactive approach of growing a bunch of plant families all together in the same bed as a polyculture. Now, plants in different families will have different root structures that make full use of the bed, feeding the life down below. They can also attract beneficial insects to each other or confuse pests that have trouble finding their favorite crop when it's mixed in with others. As in the buckwheat and legume examples, they can also help each other out by making nutrients available. I have 3 of these polyculture beds, shown here with the yellow ring around them, and I try to space them out evenly in my rotation so that the beds get this burst of goodness on a regular basis. If I now expand this view to show all of the plant families, you can see that my root crop bed has 4 different families in it, this mixed tunnel bed has 7, and my melon and bean bed, that we'll cover in a minute, has 3. Back to the bed. Once the last of the edamame is out of there, I crimp down the cover crop. I fold a tarp in half and leave it in place for about 3 weeks to thoroughly kill the cover crop until it is brown and crispy. I then use my bulb planter right around Labor Day to transplant my winter brassicas, mostly cabbage, straight into the debris. By Halloween, the frost tender vining crops have been harvested and removed, and I can convert the bed into a high tunnel for the winter by covering the trellis in greenhouse plastic and giving it some internal supports. At this point, I add an insulating layer of leaves around the base of the mature plants to help shield them from winter temperatures. Now, I hit my Persephone period of less than 10 hours of daylight per day about 10 days after Halloween, and at that point, the growth slows to effectively nothing. So I'll harvest out of this bed as long as there are anything left to harvest. I cut everything off at the soil line, other than the carrots, obviously, and I leave roots to decompose under that protective layer of leaves, keeping it in place until the following spring. Year 8, this is basically the same as year 2, shown all together here for efficiency. I transplant into the cover crop on Mother's Day, add compost on top of the debris, and a new cover crop on Labor Day. I terminate that around Halloween and cover it with leaves. The only difference I will flag is that I don't include any Daikon radish in the cover crop mix on this bed because next year this will not have root crops in it. Instead it has broccoli, our next point in the rotation. This is year 9. Once again, we start with those debris from the year before. Around St. Patrick's, I rake off only the outer foot or so of that debris into my compost, leaving the rest in place. I'm going to be planting pole drying beans along both sides of the trellis, flagging the one drawback of all these cover crop debris being left in place: slugs. This is an ideal slug habitat. Now, bean plants in particular, I have found are very susceptible to slug damage. If I try to plant a bean plant directly into this cover crop residue, they never have a fighting chance and they're just consumed by slugs. That's why for my bean plants in particular, I always rake the debris off. I found that if I remove about a solid foot of those debris off of it, the slugs tend to stay towards the center of the bed in that residue, and they don't venture out to molest those bean plants. I won't be planting those for a couple of months, but I rake this back right around St. Patrick's to make sure the slugs retreat fully from that area. Around Tax Day, I use my bulb planter to transplant broccoli directly into the debris on the bed. By Mother's Day, it's time to put in the beans. I use a stirrup hoe to weed along the base of the trellis and remove anything that popped up in the meantime, and then I sow my pole drying beans. By Labor Day, my broccoli is usually still going strong, with its bolting delayed by that shady bean tunnel, but the plants are fully mature, and I can prune off the lower leaves if necessary, and then add a layer of compost directly on top of the debris, into which I then sow my usual pea and oat cover crop blend. By Halloween, the broccoli is done, the cover crop has grown up around it, and the pole beans have all been harvested. I cut off the bean plants at the soil, and I leave the roots to decompose as I remove the trellis. With the trellis out of the way, it's the usual process. I crimp the cover crop, use the tarp for about a week until the cover crop lays flat, add the layer of leaves. Moving to our 10th and final year, we have my melon and bean bed where I use a mustard cover crop for a different purpose. On St. Patrick's Day, I rake the debris off into my compost, then wait until Tax Day when I use a stirrup hoe to terminate weeds. Then I add a tarp to pre-warm the soil. And by Mother's Day, we're past the risk of frost, and I plant 4 melon plants into the bed, 2 on each side planted down the center, with pinto beans, a half-runner type, planted along the same line. I do seed the whole bed with mustard at the same time that I plant everything else. I'd previously flagged the benefits of mustard as a soil fumigant and as a pollinator plant, but here there's 2 other reasons why I'm using it. First, it has a very open structure. Physically, it's very long and skinny, and you get a lot of airflow through it, you get a lot of sunlight coming into it, and consequently it is not a slug habitat, and I will not have an issue with pinto beans, even with a heavy seeding of mustard on the bed. Second is pest confusion. I have found through trial and error that when I plant my squash plants and my melons with mustard nearby, not only does it attract pollinators, but it seems to confuse pests like squash vine borers, and I get much less issue with those pests on the squash vines and melon vines that are surrounded by mustard. Now, Michigan's growing season is borderline for getting any really meaningful harvest from heat-loving melon plants, so I cover the growing areas with slitted row cover for extra heat to help my melon plants get established and are not especially hot May and June. By the 4th of July, I've removed all of that slitted row cover and added my trellises. The melons and the pinto beans are moving across those trellises, and the mustard has grown up around them, attracting pollinators and confusing pests. Helpfully, it especially covers the base of those vines, and that tends to be where squash vine borers do the most damage. I allow the mustard to set seed and reseed itself in the bed, and I'll periodically add more mustard seed on top to make sure that there's always a fresh batch flowering and attracting pollinators. By Halloween, the pinto beans and melons are done. I'll cut them all off at the ground, leaving the roots to decompose and remove the trellises. The bean roots add nitrogen, helping to offset what that heavy feeding melon took out of the bed during the growing season. From here, it's going to feel very familiar. I crimp down the mustard, add the tarp, wait until it's laying very flat, and add my leaves. And now we're back to the fallow year, and this bed gets a break from growing anything. I promised I would end this with a linear timeline view for you all, so let's build that out. The columns here are each 1 week, and I've color-coded the weeks that have one of my milestone holidays landing in them. The rows are my 10 beds. Starting with St. Patrick's, aka Fork Your Soil Day, I go through with a rake and I remove the debris from 5 of my 10 beds and dump all of that in my compost pile. Altogether, that probably takes me maybe an hour and a half for all the beds. I use a pitchfork to deeply loosen the soil in 3 beds, and that takes about half an hour per bed for another hour and a half of work. I sow my pea and oat cover crop on the fallow bed, rake it in and water it well. In total, this is all probably about a half a day's work. The weekend around tax day is my main day for spring planting. I put in my spring crops and I put tarps on 2 beds to pre-warm the soil before summer planting. This is all core garden work, and it's not something extra that I'm doing for the soil health. Similarly, Mother's Day weekend is a planting date for me, but now it's for my summer crops. So I call this one Summer Planting Day. In total, I'm putting in crops into 6 beds, and while it's a lot of work, it's just my core gardening work, and it's not something extra just for the soil. The fallow bed is the only one getting worked on just for soil reasons, and it needs maybe 30 minutes to terminate all of the cover crop, and then 2 weeks later, it's about 45 minutes of time to spread the compost and plant some buckwheat. The 4th of July does not have a ton of work, and that's good because it is uncomfortably hot here. That's the time that I terminate the fallow bed, and fortunately, it has an overhead bean trellis to give me shade while I do it. 2 weeks later, I'll spread compost and sow the mustard cover crop, and again, I'll be glad to have that shady overhead trellis. The polyculture bed gets overseeded with fall cover and mustard, and it also comes with a helpful shady tunnel to keep me a bit cooler as I work. National Lazy Day, ironically, is a time of a little bit more work for me. That's my big dig stuff day, and it's around that time that I harvest the last of my spring root crops, pitchfork the bed, and reseed it with a cover crop and mustard. It's also right around this time when I dig up my potatoes and set them aside to cure, digging in the debris as I go. I harvest the last of my edamame from 1/2 of my polyculture bed and terminate that cover crop. And while the harvesting itself is core gardening work and not something extra, the related soil prep does add time. I'd estimate it adds probably 1 to 2 full days of incremental work. Labor Day weekend is always very busy for me, and this is the one date on here where the work is almost entirely for the soil. I transplant my winter brassicas, and that's core work, but otherwise everything else happening here is all about terminating crops, adding compost, and seeding and cover crops. The 6 beds that I work on will take me about half a day each for a total of about 3 full days of work. I usually spread that out over the week and take advantage of the long weekend. Halloween is my other date for soil-centric work. We're raking up the leaves anyway, but terminating the crops takes time, and trench composting the sweet potatoes is almost a full day of work all on its own. I can terminate cover crops in all of the beds in about 45 minutes per bed. A week or so later, when I spread the leaves previously bagged up by my husband and son, it goes much faster. That's maybe 20 to 30 minutes per bed or half a day's time. I get that it looks like a lot, but all in all, I spend a lot less time working on the soil than I do on my core gardening tasks of planting, harvesting, pruning, weeding, etc. And with the soil work, I'm doing something proactive that feels very nurturing for the garden in order to do less work later, battling diseases and pests and dealing with unhealthy plants. For me, while it is some extra work, it is enjoyable work, and it's definitely worth it. Now, if you want a handy sheet to summarize this entire video, it's really that last page, so let me put that back up and just wait for a second in case you want to screenshot it. I know that was a lot to take in. It was a lot for me to make. And if you stuck with me all the way to the end, I really appreciate it. I hope it was reasonably succinct and clear, despite being long. But if there's anything I didn't cover, or if you have questions or saw something confusing or contradictory, please do leave a comment below, and I'll do my best to respond. If I see a lot of questions popping up repeatedly, I will put together an FAQ page on my website. That's wellgroundedgardens.com. Otherwise, I hope that was helpful and that you had a great gardening season and everything is winding down nicely for you. Until next time.